What if I told you that American independence wasn't won by muskets and militias, but by a naval battle most Americans have never heard of? What if the fate of liberty itself came down to 90 minutes of cannon fire on the waters of the Chesapeake Bay? Welcome back to Liberty Unfolded, where we dig into the forgotten moments that shaped the world we live in today. I'm your host, and today we're diving into September 5th, 1781, the day that a French admiral you've probably never heard of made a decision that would echo through the halls of history for centuries to come. It's the summer of 1781, and the American Revolution is hanging by a thread. George Washington's Continental Army is barely holding together. The British, led by General Cornwallis, have been dominating the southern theater, and it looks like they are about to crush the rebellion once and for all. But here's where our story gets interesting, and where most history books get it wrong. This wasn't just Americans fighting British. This was a global conflict with France, Spain, and the Netherlands all at war with Britain. The American Revolution, it was just one front in what historians call the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Now, let me introduce you to a man whose name should be as famous as George Washington's Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse. This French naval commander was about to make the most crucial decision in American history, and he almost didn't make it at all. Picture de Grasse in his cabin aboard the flagship Ville de Paris, the most powerful warship in the world at that time. He's holding two sets of orders from the French Ministry of Marine. One directs him to the Caribbean, where British sugar islands are ripe for the taking. These islands weren't just territory, they were economic gold mines, generating more wealth for Britain than all 13 American colonies combined. The other order is more speculative, coordinate with Washington and Rochaim, bow for an attack on. Somewhere, maybe New York, maybe Virginia, the plans were still being debated. Here's what makes this decision so incredible. De Grasse chose the uncertain American operation over the guaranteed Caribbean prizes. But why? Because he understood something that most people missed. This wasn't just about winning battles. It was about breaking British naval supremacy forever. The Sugar Islands would still be there next year, but the opportunity to trap a major British army might never come again. De Grasse wrote to his superiors, the capture of Cornwallis would be worth more than 20 Sugar Islands. That's the kind of strategic thinking that separates history makers from footnotes. He wasn't just a naval commander, he was a visionary who saw the bigger picture. But here's the part that gives me chills. De Grasse made this decision knowing he was risking everything. His career, his reputation, even his life. French naval officers who lost major battles didn't just get demoted, they got caught, marshaled, imprisoned, or worse. The pressure on this man's shoulders was absolutely immense. And get this, he had to make the decision while dealing with a crisis in his own fleet. Several of his captains were openly questioning the American mission, arguing that they should stick to traditional naval warfare in familiar Caribbean waters. De Grasse had to convince his own officers that this risky venture was worth it. Imagine trying to rally your team around a plan that defied conventional wisdom and could end all their careers. Here's what makes this even more incredible. De Grasse chose America, but he did it with borrowed money. The French government was broke. They'd been funding the American war effort for years and were on the verge of bankruptcy. So de Grasse did something unprecedented. He convinced the Spanish colonial government in Cuba to loan him money to fund the operation. But let me tell you the full story of how desperate this situation really was. France had spent over 3 billion livres on the American war. That's roughly equivalent to $13 billion today. The French treasury was so empty that they couldn't even pay their own sailors. There were reports of French ships arriving in Caribbean ports with crews literally starving because they hadn't received wages or supplies in months. Now imagine being de Grasse, looking at this impossible situation. He needs money to buy supplies, pay his crews, and maintain his ships. The British are getting regular supply convoys from London, But the French supply lines are breaking down. So, what does he do? He sails to Havana and meets with Spanish colonial officials who are supposed to be his allies but have their own agenda. The Spanish weren't doing this out of pure altruism. They wanted to weaken Britain too, but they were also concerned about revolutionary ideas spreading to their own colonies. Here's de Grasse, essentially pitching the Spanish on funding a revolution that could inspire their own subjects to rebel. It was a delicate diplomatic dance that required incredible skill. The amount he secured was staggering, over 500,000 pesos, enough to fund the entire naval operation. But here's the kicker: he had to personally guarantee the loan. If the operation failed, if his ships were captured or destroyed, de Grasse would be financially ruined. He was literally betting his family's future on American independence. This international cooperation was unprecedented in naval history. You had French ships commanded by French officers, funded by Spanish silver, crewed by sailors from across Europe and the Caribbean, all working together to defeat the British. It was the 18th century equivalent of a United Nations peacekeeping operation, except they were fighting for the radical idea that people could govern themselves. De Grasse arrived at the Chesapeake on August 30th, 1781, with 28 ships of the line, the largest fleet ever assembled in North American waters. But here's where it gets really intense. He had to make a split-second decision that would determine everything. Let me paint you the picture of September 5th, 1781. It's about 11:30 in the morning, and the lookouts on the French flagship spot sails on the horizon. At first, there's hope maybe it's the French squadron from Newport that they're expecting. But as the ships get closer, the terrible truth becomes clear. It's the British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves, 19 ships strong, in perfect battle formation. Now, here's where de Grasse found himself in an absolutely impossible situation. His fleet was at anchor inside the Chesapeake Bay, spread out in a defensive line. About 1,800 of his sailors were ashore, helping the army besiege Yorktown. His ships weren't ready for battle. They were in what naval officers call maintenance mode, with cannon removed for repairs, rigging being adjusted, and supplies being loaded. The conventional wisdom was crystal clear: stay put. Use the defensive advantage of the bay and let the British come to you. De Grasse's own officers were advising exactly that. Captain de Bougainville, one of his most experienced commanders, argued that leaving the bay would be suicide. "We'll be caught in formation, undermanned and vulnerable," he warned. But de Grasse understood something that his officers didn't. This wasn't just about winning a naval battle. This was about controlling the narrative. If he stayed in the bay, the British could claim they controlled the seas. They could resupply Cornwallis, evacuate his army, or even launch a surprise attack on the French positions. So de Grasse made the call that defines courage in military history. He ordered the fleet to weigh anchor and sail out to meet the British in open water. Can you imagine the stress? Every minute of preparation could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Sailors were literally running back to their ships from shore duty. Officers were shouting orders while cannon were being wheeled back into position. The decision took less than 30 minutes, but it changed the course of world history. As the French ships began to move, every man aboard knew they were sailing into a battle that would determine whether America would be free or remain a British colony forever. Admiral Graves, on the other hand, made a series of fatal errors that still make naval historians shake their heads. He had the tactical advantage: his fleet was in perfect formation, ready for battle. But instead of pressing his attack, he followed rigid British naval doctrine. Here's the thing about the British Navy in 1781. They were absolutely dominant, but they'd become slaves to their own success. They fought by the book, expecting everyone else to do the same. De Grasse didn't get that memo. Let me explain just how catastrophic Graves' mistakes were. First, he had perfect intelligence. He knew exactly where the French fleet was, how many ships they had, and that they were caught off guard. British spies had been reporting French movements for days. This should have been a textbook victory, but Graves was trapped by something called the fighting instructions, the rigid tactical doctrine that had made the British Navy invincible for decades. According to these rules, ships had to maintain perfect line formation, engage enemy ships in order, and never break formation without specific signals. It was like fighting with one hand tied behind your back. Here's where it gets really frustrating. Graves could see that the French fleet was struggling to form up. Their ships were coming out of the bay in a ragged line, still trying to organize themselves. A more aggressive commander would have attacked immediately, hitting the French while they were vulnerable. Instead, Graves waited. He actually slowed down his fleet to let the French organize themselves into proper battle formation. Think about that, he gave away his greatest advantage out of politeness. It's like a boxer waiting for his opponent to put on gloves before throwing a punch. The British were so confident in their superiority that they couldn't imagine losing to a properly fought battle. The actual engagement lasted about 90 minutes, and it was brutal. The lead British ships took a devastating beating because they had to fight while the rest of their fleet was still getting into position. HMS Terrible was so damaged she had to be abandoned and sunk later. The Montagu lost her main mast. The Intrepid was hulled below the waterline. But here's the real tragedy from the British perspective. They had the French outnumbered in the actual fighting. Only the lead ships of each fleet were engaged, and the British had brought their most powerful ships to the front. They should have won this battle decisively. Instead, after 90 minutes of fighting, Graves ordered his fleet to withdraw. Not because he was defeated, but because he realized he'd made a strategic error. By the time he figured out what had happened, it was too late. The French controlled the Chesapeake, and Cornwallis was trapped. Think about poor Cornwallis down at Yorktown. He'd been promised that the British fleet would come to his rescue. Every day, he's scanning the horizon looking for British sails. Instead, he sees French ships, lots of them. But let me tell you the full story of what Cornwallis was going through, because it's absolutely heartbreaking from a human perspective. This was a man who had dominated the southern theater of the war. He'd won decisive victories at Camden and Guilford Courthouse. He'd chased Daniel Morgan and Nathanael Greene across the Carolinas. He was considered one of Britain's most competent generals. Now, suddenly, he found himself in a trap that was tightening every day. His fortifications at Yorktown were strong, but they were designed to hold until the Royal Navy arrived. Every morning, he'd climb to the highest point in his defensive works and look out over the York River toward the Chesapeake, hoping to see British ships coming to his rescue. Instead, day after day, he saw French ships. The psychological impact was devastating. His soldiers could see it too. Their invincible general was trapped, and help wasn't coming. Morale began to collapse. Desertions increased. Some of his officers started quietly suggesting that maybe it was time to consider terms. The supply situation was even worse. Cornwallis had moved to Yorktown because it was supposed to be a naval base easily supplied and evacuated by sea. But now the French fleet controlled those same waters. Food started running low. Medicine became scarce. The horses were dying, and there wasn't enough fodder to keep them alive. British intelligence had failed catastrophically. London thought the French fleet was still in the Caribbean. They had no idea that Grasse had brought such a massive force to American waters. When Cornwallis sent desperate messages asking for evacuation, the Admiralty was already planning rescue operations based on completely wrong information. Here's the part that really gets to me. Cornwallis actually tried to escape. On the night of October 16th, he attempted to ferry his army across the York River to Gloucester Point, where he might have been able to break out overland, but a sudden storm scattered his boats and he had to abandon the attempt. Even nature seemed to be conspiring against him. The surrender on October 19, 1781, was really just the inevitable conclusion of what happened on September 5th in the Chesapeake. When Cornwallis handed over his sword, he wasn't just surrendering an army, he was acknowledging that Britain had lost control of the seas. The world's greatest naval power had been outmaneuvered by a French admiral who understood that sometimes you have to break the rules to win. But here's the part that will blow your mind. The Battle of the Chesapeake didn't just win American independence. It fundamentally changed how the world works. Think about it. Before 1781, the idea that a group of colonists could successfully rebel against a global empire was laughable. After Yorktown, suddenly every oppressed people on earth had a playbook. The French Revolution, the Latin American independence movements, the Irish struggles, they all traced their inspiration back to what happened in America. But let me explain just how profound this change really was. For centuries, the established order of the world was simple. Empires ruled, subjects obeyed, and the idea of popular sovereignty was considered dangerous radicalism. The divine right of kings wasn't just a political theory, it was the foundation of how most people understood government and society. The American Revolution, secured by the Battle of the Chesapeake, proved that this ancient system could be overthrown. Not just overthrown, replaced with something better. Within a decade, the French Revolution erupted, directly inspired by American success. The revolutionaries in Paris weren't just copying American ideas, they were building on them, taking them further. But the ripple effects went far beyond Europe. In Haiti, enslaved people led by Toussaint Louverture launched their own revolution, explicitly citing American precedent. In Latin America, Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin led independence movements that drew directly from American experience. Even in Ireland, revolutionaries like Wolfe Tone looked to America as proof that British rule could be broken. Here's what's really incredible. The Battle of the Chesapeake established a new principle in international law, that a people could legitimately overthrow their government and expect recognition from other nations. Before 1781, rebellion was always seen as illegitimate, regardless of the cause. After American independence was secured, the world had to grapple with the idea that sometimes rebellion was justified. The economic implications were just as revolutionary. American independence broke the mercantilist system that had dominated global trade for centuries. Suddenly, there was a major power that believed in free trade rather than imperial monopolies. This opened up new possibilities for commerce and economic development that are still shaping our world today. And it all came down to 90 minutes of naval combat that most people have never heard of. Every time you hear about a successful independence movement, every time you see people standing up to authoritarian rule, every time you witness the peaceful transfer of power in a democracy, you're seeing the legacy of what de Grasse accomplished in the Chesapeake. Let me tell you about one sailor who was there, a young midshipman named Horatio Nelson. Yes, that Nelson, the future hero of Trafalgar. He was serving on a British ship during the Chesapeake battle, watching his country's naval supremacy crack for the first time. Nelson later wrote that the defeat taught him that rigid tactics could be overcome by bold action. When he destroyed the French fleet at Trafalgar in 1805, he used the same kind of unconventional thinking that de Grasse had used against the British. On the French side, there was Captain Louis, Antoine de Bougainville, the same man who'd sailed around the world and had an island named after him. He commanded the rear division of de Grasse's fleet, and he later said that the Battle of the Chesapeake was the most important action he'd ever fought in. These weren't just names in a history book, these were real people who understood that they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. De Grasse wrote to his wife that he felt the weight of two continents, on his shoulders. Can you imagine that pressure? So why does this matter today? Because the Battle of the Chesapeake teaches us something crucial about liberty. It's never won by one person or one nation acting alone. American independence was achieved through a coalition of French, Spanish, Dutch, and American forces, all working together against tyranny. Every time you vote, every time you speak freely, every time you practice your religion or criticize your government without fear, you're benefiting from what happened on September 5th, 1781. A French admiral using Spanish money commanding French sailors fighting British ships so that American colonists could be free. The next time someone tells you that America succeeded alone, remind them about Grasse and the Battle of the Chesapeake. Liberty isn't just an American value, it's a human value. And it's always been defended by people from all over the world working together. If this story gave you a new perspective on American independence, hit that like button. It helps us reach more history lovers like yourself. And if you want to dive deeper into the forgotten moments that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. I want to hear from you in the comments. What other forgotten battles do you think changed the course of history? And if you're a history teacher, feel free to share this video with your students. Let's make sure the next generation knows about Admiral de Grasse and the battle that won American independence. Remember, history isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why it still matters today. Until next time, keep unfolding liberty.